Jews and Arabs, cowboys and Indians. Yes, the connection is obvious in today's world of political make-believe, in which barbaric, sadistic killers are portrayed by the West's overeducated and obscenely self-righteous student body as noble freedom fighters, and in which rampant genocidal groupthink against Jews in Palestine, driven by religious and political Islamic chauvinism, is couched as noble resistance. These children of my generation of civil rights and eco-warriors, hippies and yippies, sexual libertines and puritanical feminist prudes, anti-war demonstrators and revolutionary Marxist university professors, disciples of Timothy Leary's and Charles Manson's mind-altering psychedelic revolutionism, are the living proof, if any were needed, of the truth of the saying that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The pudding is liberal progressivism, a current euphemism for communism. The proof is an entire generation that's lost its mind in infantile self-indulgence, having grown only in body but not in maturity. It's an ugly spectacle, and yet there's nothing new here. Human eyes have seen it all before, weary of the tragic repetition of evil's banality, with every successive generation seduced by the ideal of establishing heaven on earth without needing to carry the cross of Western culture. All generations since people first took up that cross have struggled to carry it and keep it free of corruption. And that struggle has continually waxed and waned, its periods of success always bearing the seeds of complacency and wanton depravity. Realists have always faced this head-on and recognized that it's the human condition working out its contradictions, in which every virtue taken to excess becomes a vice, and correspondingly every party of the good becomes a party of evil. I know of no party of evil that ever believed itself to be anything other than a party of the good. The evils that all have carried out have always been treated as dictated by necessity in pursuit of the goods that they believed in and loyally served. This is simply a fact, and every mature person understands it, but no immature firebrand, zealot or coward ever does. Here, immaturity equates to naive ignorance, the child's hero being dismissed by his or her wiser parents as, at best, a dangerous fool. Even the ruthless revolutionary leader of the Russian Communist Party, Vladimir Lenin, complained of the infantile disorder of left-wing communism, noting the stark distinction between the revolutionary posturing of ideological idealists and the grim realism of the more sober-minded professional revolutionaries who don't just make revolutions in outbursts of outraged righteous indignance, but dutifully go on to carry out the cold acts of intellectual prostitution and political violence needed to preserve their revolutions once they've been made. This has been as true of Catholic popes and Protestant kings as it has of communist and fascist political functionaries. Creators always need to uphold the existence of their creations. Lenin hit the nail on the head. Idealistic posturing is an infantile disorder, and it's the same now as it was when he wrote his famous pamphlet of this title during the post-revolutionary turmoil of Russia in 1920. How can I be so sure of myself in making this criticism? There's no place for false humility here. I'm 72 years old. I am my daughter's father and the grandfather of her 3 beautiful children, but I'm also a very imperfect sinner, and for this reason I've had to make maturity my profession. By this I mean that I long ago took on the responsibility of professing and teaching maturity to my daughter, setting myself the duty of practicing what I preached. In becoming my daughter's father, I became father to myself, demanding of myself that I leave the foolish things of childhood behind. I'm not naturally mature. If ever I was an innocent infant, it could only have been in my mother's womb. Since birth, my story has been one of the total self-centeredness of being a helpless infant, being dragged into maturity by my parents and by my country's good and decent institutions, all too often with my reluctant steps forward, being followed by 2 triumphantly defiant steps back. No one more belongs in the confession boxes of the Catholic Church than me. I'm the opposite of idealism. I'm neither an idealist nor an ideal, unless your ideal is someone who consistently fails to fulfill his ideals and is forced to admit this failure to himself and to his maker. These are my only qualifications for judging the postmodern pandemic of infantilism that has swept over the West over the last 50 or 60 years. What is it about the ongoing cowboys and Indians trope? A trope is a type of story that has universal positive or negative exemplary meaning that makes it a recurring moral theme in popular culture today. Even Russian, Arab and Iranian leaders speak of it, once admiringly but more often now contemptuously. It's the American myth of the raw wilderness being subdued by rude but basically decent settlers from Christian Europe, and their struggles amongst themselves to submit to lawful governance by institutions themselves governed by the values of Christian civilization, which were eventually summed up in America's political constitution as the self-evident right of every US citizen and every human being everywhere to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Being conceived as a universal right, this principle is necessarily a self-limiting one. It does not extend to the liberty to deprive anyone else of this same right. It's been the fundamental governing principle of the United States of America and has supported the American dream for over 200 years. It is radically different to the egalitarian principle emblazoned as the motto of the French Revolution and which continues to inspire socialism and communism, which is why the US has been a bulwark against both since their modern inception, but not without constant ideological struggle within her own polity, her imperfections, including slavery and the racism that followed it, providing ample grist to the socialist mill. In the first stories of the meetings between European migrants and America's already established human inhabitants, European moral and political preconceptions and prejudices were already present in Fennimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. The goods and evils of Christian European civilization and American primevalism stand side by side in a complex narrative of good and evil that rejects Rousseau's simplistic postulation of the noble savage, intended to counter and supersede the doctrine of original sin taught by the Catholic and Protestant churches, while at the same time rejecting a chauvinistic, parochial European corruption of Christian universalism too. We get more than just a flavour of this attitude in Longfellow's poetry, Longfellow being the most popular poet ever in 19th century America. Ye, whose hearts are fresh and simple, who have faith in God and nature, who believe that in all ages every human heart is human, that even in savage bosoms there are longings, yearnings, strivings for the good they comprehend not, that the feeble hands and helpless, groping blindly in the darkness, touch God's right hand in that darkness and are lifted up and strengthened. Listen to this simple story, to this Song of Hiawatha. The Song of Hiawatha, Longfellow, 1855. These may be the words of one certain of the civilized superiority of Christianity over all other religions known to him. But they clearly aren't the mean, contemptuous words of the fabled white supremacists of the progressive radical imagination, seeking to blame the demon of civilization for the world's sufferings. The Protestant Longfellow wrote his paternalistic Christian poetry contemporaneously with Karl Marx's writing for the New York Tribune, which was highly popular across America at that time. Between 1853 and 1861, Marx wrote 487 articles for that newspaper and influenced generations of Americans to come. Not unconnected to this was the rapid collapse of Longfellow's popularity in favour of a new, more modern and self-effacing breed of poets. Longfellow had sought to mythologize the foundations of modern America, involving its original peoples in that romantic mythology. Marx's focus was on the immense and growing power of American capitalism and its perfidious role in the enslavement of Africans and the unrelenting, comprehensive destruction of the American Indians' way of life. For Marx, America was a veritable laboratory of contending social systems, which he studied avidly to inform his revolutionary political views and his writing of Capital, his magnum opus. For him, the revolutionary character of capitalism, which everywhere destroyed traditions and old forms of economy to be replaced by capitalism's stupendous creativity and its simplification of society into two great contending classes, the exploited wage labourers and the capitalist class that exploited them, was a progressive good that prepared the social ground for the final revolution, the overthrow of exploitation itself by the last exploited class. The political world internationally polarized around positions of support for Marx's stance and contrasting positions of opposition to it. And for long, this new world was no place for poets like Longfellow. For that matter, it was increasingly no place for historical Christianity either. For the followers of Marx, Christianity was the primary symbol of European colonialism and imperialism, which should elicit shame rather than pride among decent progressive people. This view was passionately contested by those who loved America and her Constitution, and in America's booming entertainment culture, the cowboy film became one of the great celebrators of pioneering American virtue, in which the values of hard work on capital-intensive farms and cattle ranches, and in the ever-expanding network of towns and eventually railways that served these ventures, proudly and shamelessly defended themselves against the magnificent but historically doomed warrior peoples of America's plains, mountains, and forests. In the cowboy films, cruelty towards Indians was usually scorned and treated as itself savage and boorish. But regardless of their sympathy and pity, even the decent and good stood behind the fate that consigned the glorious but brutal days of the American Indian to the past. This changed with the merging of the civil rights movement of the early 1960s with the anti-Vietnam War movement that soon followed it, both of which struggles arose in the wake of the Kinsey reports on male and female sexuality in America, all three being greatly influenced by the influx into American universities of Marxist academics from Hitler's Nazi Germany in the 1930s. This is how it came to be that America, and in turn the entire West that she'd led since the end of World War II, was convulsed in the late 1960s by a generation which no longer reflexively supported the appointed defenders of the American dream. I was 15 in 1968 and am one of that generation, though thankfully British and not subject to the American draft that sent so many young Americans off to Vietnam, never to return. Representing the West's rejection of communism, just as my own country's military actions in Malaya did, the Vietnam War was my war as well as America's, and I was as horrified by it as everyone else of my generation who, like me, had been prepared by our education system to go on to university. I didn't go on to university. I dropped out too soon for that. I dedicated myself to living a hippie life, doing my best to use how I lived to heal the fissures in the human soul and in the natural world inflicted by industrial capitalism and its war in Vietnam. My politics hardened and I became a communist as the American war in Vietnam came to a close, only to be followed by equally brutal, though less extensive, conflicts in El Salvador and Nicaragua. These were paralleled by US support for repressive governments in Guatemala, Honduras, and Argentina, while a coup was engineered by the CIA in Chile. Even Greece became subject to American political interference, the so-called Cold War remaining very hot for decades to come. What was it that we were doing back then that would bring about the corruption that's all around us in the West today? One only need read Marx's Communist Manifesto of 1848 to get the measure of it. According to this manifesto, the inherent characteristics of capitalist development made a communist reaction to it intent on abolishing all forms of exploitation, an absolutely necessary inevitability. And these forms of exploitation included the exploitation of labourers by the owners of capital, the exploitation of less developed countries by more developed ones, the exploitation of wives by husbands and women by men, the exploitation of the countryside by cities, and the exploitation of nature by industry. Add in the exploitation of homosexuals by heterosexuals, transgendered people by transphobic people, non-binary sexual orientations by cisgender orientations, pagans by Christians, non-white by whites, and victimized people by generally hateful people, and the match with today's woke political progressivism is complete and unmistakable. Progressives aim to abolish all of these forms of supposed exploitation, using the West's political democracy to effect this in the name of democratization. They aim to effect the complete abolition of all of the West's traditional natural values, including representative democracy, in the name of freedom, equality, and social justice. It's the movement towards this that has entered all of the West's cultural institutions, including the movie industry. And now the heroes of cowboy films are as often as not tough, yet strangely well manicured heroines fighting the good fight along with Indians and African Americans against dastardly white European males, void of any redeeming virtues, and who commit rape at the drop of a greasy cowboy hat. And for every movie or TV show in which this formula is transparent and silly, there's another, like the allegory of the Vietnam War, Soldier Blue, whose visceral realism is repulsive, sickening, and profoundly shocking. This is the archetypal image that today's progressive Western parents have en masse given their boys of their fathers and grandfathers and their fathers and grandfathers ad infinitum, to first identify with and then reject in paroxysms of guilt and shame. Now these boys, the pride of their liberated sisters and their righteously repentant mothers and fathers, march our streets condemning hate while hating the countries they've disowned and their histories. Primed to convulse with contemptuous outrage at any mention of the sloganized words capitalism, colonialism, exploitation, supremacism, apartheid, traditionalism, binary, and so on, the spectre and shame of every European horror perpetrated in the name of democracy or Christianity against non-white, non-Europeans overwhelms their minds, making them react in frenzies of righteous determination to fight for their now thoroughly Marxist conceptions of justice by any means necessary, as pro-Palestinian slogans after the obscenity of October the 7th paradoxically shamelessly threatened. In this Punch and Judy virtual pastiche of reality, what cowboys did to the Indians, Jews are doing, all facts to the contrary, to supposedly hapless Palestinian Arabs. And just as with the very real atrocious savagery of the Indians against white Christian settlers throughout America in her foundational years, so is the savagery of Arabs against the Jewish settler colonial entity, Israel, as Palestinian propagandists cannily call her, regarded by progressives as a natural reaction which, though terrible, is fundamentally just. This, in a nutshell, is how the dishonest intellectual sleights of hand of Karl Marx and his followers have induced our great civilization to forget its true values, replace them with corrupted copies, and then commit political, cultural, and military suicide, but not before sanctioning a second Holocaust against the Jews, those shamefaced, modern-day, hate-filled cowboys.